What would you do if you woke up one morning to find out that your HOA had decided your view, the one you paid for, the one you cherished, wasn't yours anymore? That was exactly what happened to me. When Karen, the HOA president, stood on my front porch and told me, with that infuriating smirk of hers, that my trees needed to come down because they disrupted the community aesthetic, I almost laughed. Almost. I had moved into this neighborhood 6 months ago, thinking I had finally found my dream home. A quiet place, surrounded by greenery, where I could unwind after long days. I had worked hard to afford this house, and every morning when I sipped my coffee and looked out at the rolling hills, I felt at peace. Until the HOA decided that my peace didn't fit their agenda. At first, it was the little things. The letters in my mailbox nitpicking the color of my front door. A fine for my mailbox being too decorative, whatever that meant. A complaint that my grass was too lush. It was irritating, sure, but nothing I hadn't expected from an HOA. I ignored it, chalking it up to petty neighborhood politics. But then came the trees. The ones that lined my property, the ones that shaded my backyard, the ones that made this house feel like home. Karen stood there, clipboard in hand, telling me they needed to be removed immediately because they blocked the view, not mine, but the one she claimed belonged to the community. As if I had no say in what happened on my own land. That's when I realized this wasn't just about trees. This was about control. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way my neighbors whispered to each other at meetings, glancing at me like I had unknowingly stepped into some secret war. The way Karen always seemed to be watching my house, lurking around the neighborhood as if she owned it. And then one afternoon, as I sat in my living room drinking coffee, I saw them, 2 HOA board members, walking along my fence, pointing at my trees, scribbling notes. They weren't just inspecting. They were plotting. I had never considered myself a confrontational person, but something about the way Karen and her board members skulked around my yard like they owned it flipped a switch in me. They weren't just nosy neighbors enforcing petty rules, they were trespassers, intruders, people who had convinced themselves they had the power to dictate how I lived my life. I wasn't about to let that happen. That night, I stayed up reading every single HOA document I could find. I scoured their bylaws, highlighting anything remotely related to property rights, landscaping regulations, and community aesthetics. What I found made my blood boil. There was no official rule about blocking a view. Nowhere did it state that trees had to be cut down unless they posed a safety hazard. What's worse? The so-called community aesthetic Karen kept throwing in my face wasn't clearly defined in any official documentation. The HOA had been making it up as they went along, twisting vague guidelines into absolute authority. I wasn't going to fight this battle alone. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with Mark Reynolds, a lawyer who specialized in property disputes. Sitting across from him in his office, I laid out everything, the letters, the fines, the constant harassment. He listened carefully, flipping through my file, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. They don't have a legal leg to stand on. They can't take your trees, they can't dictate your view, and they sure as hell can't invade your property to enforce rules that don't exist. That was all I needed to hear. I went home and started documenting everything. I took photos of my yard, my fence, my trees, anything that could later be used as evidence. Every conversation with Karen or her cronies was now recorded. Every letter they sent went into a growing file of proof that they were overstepping their authority. Then, as if sensing my resistance, the HOA went on the offensive. A formal violation notice arrived, this time claiming that my fence was out of compliance. That was a new one. I had never received any mention of my fence before, and as far as I knew, it had been there for years without issue. Something wasn't right. That night, I checked the security footage from my front yard. What I saw sent a surge of rage through me. At 1:47 a.m., a shadow crept into the frame. It was Rick Lawson, one of the HOA board members. He walked up to my fence, measuring tape in hand, and took pictures from an angle that made it look taller than it actually was. I watched as he scribbled something down, snapped a few more deceptive shots, and scurried off like a criminal. I slammed my laptop shut. They were trying to frame me. The next morning, I stormed into the HOA meeting, my laptop in one hand, the violation notice in the other. The usual suspects were seated at the long table, Karen at the head like some self-appointed queen. She barely looked up when I entered. I didn't waste time. I pulled up the footage on the big screen and pressed play. The room fell silent as Rick's figure appeared, clear as day, trespassing on my property, manipulating the measurements. When the video ended, I turned to Karen, waiting for her reaction. She stared at me, expression unreadable, then leaned forward and folded her hands together. "This is clearly a misunderstanding," she said smoothly. Rick was simply verifying a concern brought to us by another homeowner. At 2 in the morning? I shot back. With a tape measure? You're trying to fabricate violations to bully me into compliance. Karen's lips tightened. Around her, the other board members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew. Even if they wouldn't admit it, they knew what was happening was wrong. I took a deep breath and laid down my final blow. You have two choices. Either you rescind this bogus violation and stop harassing me, or I take this to a lawyer and make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows exactly how you abuse your power. For the first time, I saw something flicker across Karen's face. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was something close. Doubt. Hesitation. But then, just as quickly, she masked it with that smug, unshakable confidence she always wore. "We'll take your concerns into consideration," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "This meeting is adjourned." I left knowing one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment I stepped out of that meeting, I knew Karen wasn't going to back down. She wasn't the type to admit defeat, especially not in front of the HOA board. If anything, exposing her tactics had only made her more determined to win. And sure enough, 2 days later, a cease and desist letter from the HOA's legal team landed in my mailbox. The message was clear: remove the trees immediately or face escalating fines and legal action. I had expected this. Karen was predictable. When intimidation failed, she turned to official-looking threats, hoping I'd cave under pressure. But I had done my research. The letter was nothing but a scare tactic, filled with vague language and empty warnings. I took it straight to Mark Reynolds, my lawyer, who skimmed through it, shook his head, and let out a short laugh. "They're bluffing," he said, setting the papers down. "There's no legal precedent for this. They can't fine you for something that isn't a violation of the bylaws. They know it, and that's why they're trying to intimidate you instead of taking you to court." Still, I wasn't naive enough to think Karen would stop here. She had already tried framing me with a fake fence violation. What was stopping her from taking this to the next level? I kept my guard up, continued documenting everything, and waited for her next move. It didn't take long. A week later, I received an email from the HOA announcing an emergency meeting regarding necessary amendments to the community's aesthetic standards. The language was deliberately vague, but I knew exactly what this was about. Karen was trying to change the rules, after the fact, so they could justify forcing me to comply. I showed up to the meeting early, but Karen was already there, sitting at the head of the table like she owned the place. The room was packed. More homeowners than usual had shown up, sensing the tension. The moment the meeting started, Karen wasted no time getting to the point. "We've received concerns from multiple residents about the obstruction of views and community cohesion. In response, we are proposing a bylaw amendment to clarify regulations regarding landscape uniformity." I leaned back in my chair, waiting for her to get to the punchline. "Effective immediately," she continued, flipping through a thick stack of papers. Any trees, hedges, or barriers that disrupt the community's aesthetic or block a shared view must be removed. This rule applies retroactively, meaning any existing obstructions must be addressed within 30 days. There it was. A complete rewriting of the rules, disguised as a clarification. And the best part? She had backdated the documents to make it seem like this rule had always existed. It was fraud, plain and simple. I glanced around the room. Some of the board members looked uneasy. They weren't all blindly loyal to Karen, some were just following her lead, afraid to speak up. But now, as she pushed them into rewriting history, they were realizing just how far she was willing to go. I raised my hand, and Karen's eyes narrowed. She knew I wasn't about to make this easy. "I have a question," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Who exactly requested this amendment? Because last I checked, the HOA rules haven't changed in years, and there was no mention of obstructed views before I moved in." Karen didn't even blink. "The board has received multiple complaints from residents. It's our duty to maintain the integrity of the community." I smiled. "Great. Can you provide documentation of those complaints? Names, dates, specific concerns? Surely, if you're drafting an amendment based on them, there's a record." Silence. Karen's fingers tightened around her pen, but she didn't answer. Because there were no complaints. She had made it all up. I turned to the other board members. "You realize what's happening here, right? She's rewriting the rules in the middle of a dispute to force me to comply. That's not governance, it's corruption." A murmur rippled through the room. I could see the doubt spreading. Even the homeowners who had once supported the HOA's strict policies were now looking between each other, whispering. Karen straightened, her voice sharp. "We are within our rights to clarify existing rules. If you have an issue with that, you're welcome to take it up through the proper legal channels." I met her gaze and smiled. "Oh, I will." With that, I gathered my things and stood up. The meeting continued, but I had heard enough. Karen had made her final mistake. By attempting to rewrite the bylaws after the fact, she had given me exactly what I needed to take this to the next level. I wasn't just going to fight her anymore. I was going to expose her. Karen thought she had the final say. She thought she could rewrite history, forge rules, and silence me with legal threats. What she didn't realize was that she had just handed me the perfect opportunity to bring her and the entire HOA down. I didn't go home after that meeting. I drove straight to the local news station. I had been following their coverage on HOA abuse cases, and I knew they wouldn't turn down a story like this. When I got there, I asked to speak with a reporter who had covered similar stories before. After a brief wait, I found myself sitting across from Lisa Harrington, a journalist known for exposing shady homeowners associations. I laid everything out for her: the harassment, the trespassing caught on camera, the fabricated violations, the last-minute rule changes. But the biggest bombshell was Karen's attempt to backdate and alter official HOA documents. Lisa listened carefully, taking notes, her expression growing more incredulous by the minute. "This is exactly the kind of case we like to expose," she said finally. "But I need more. We need homeowners who are willing to go on record." I nodded. I had a feeling I wouldn't be the only one willing to speak. Over the next few days, I started talking to my neighbors, some of whom had lived in fear of Karen and her iron grip over the HOA for years. It didn't take long before the floodgates opened. People started coming forward with their own stories: unjust fines, retaliatory actions, violations that seemed to appear out of thin air whenever someone challenged Karen's authority. One homeowner, Tom Jenkins, told me how he had been fined repeatedly for having unapproved landscaping, even though his yard matched half the houses on the street. Another neighbor, Susan Parker, revealed that Karen had once tried to evict an elderly couple for failing to repaint their shutters within an HOA-mandated timeframe. The stories kept coming, and I gathered everything: documents, letters, evidence of Karen's decade-long reign of intimidation. Then, the story broke. Lisa and her team ran a primetime exposé on Karen and the HOA, broadcasting everything from the illegal rule changes to the fabricated violations. They aired the footage of Rick Lawson trespassing on my property, the security footage catching him in the act. They interviewed other homeowners, their voices shaking with frustration and long-held resentment. And then, the community turned. Homeowners who had once stayed silent out of fear now started speaking up. People began questioning Karen's authority, demanding to see financial records, demanding proof that the HOA had been acting legally. A petition started circulating, a petition to remove Karen from the board. And then, something incredible happened. Karen disappeared. For the first time since I had moved in, I didn't see her patrolling the neighborhood, didn't hear her calling for emergency HOA meetings. Instead, an emergency meeting was called without her. The other board members, clearly shaken by the backlash and media exposure, were starting to distance themselves from her. A few days later, I got a call from Mark, my lawyer. "Ethan," he said, his tone light. "I just got word from the HOA's legal team. They want to settle." I felt my breath catch. Settle? You mean? They're dropping everything. The fines, the violation notices, the demands to remove your trees. And, he paused, clearly amused, they're offering a public apology. They're scrambling to cover their tracks. I leaned back, processing his words. Karen had lost. The HOA wasn't just dropping their case against me, they were trying to make this entire thing disappear before it blew up even further. And Karen? She was nowhere to be found. But the damage had been done. The news coverage had permanently stained the HOA's reputation. The homeowners were done being afraid. The board, under immense pressure, called for Karen's removal. Within a week, she was officially voted out. Karen may have been voted out, but she wasn't done yet. A few days after the HOA dropped their case, I received a phone call. The number was blocked, but I answered anyway, already suspecting who it would be. Her voice was dripping with venom. "You think you've won?" she spat. "You have no idea how these things work. The HOA will always have power. You'll regret this." I almost laughed. She sounded nothing like the composed, controlling woman who had tried to bully me into submission for months. Now, she was just desperate. She had lost her influence, her status, and worst of all, her fear factor. Without the HOA backing her, Karen was nothing more than an angry neighbor with no real authority. "No, Karen," I said calmly. "You lost. And you know it." There was a long silence before she hung up. That was the last time I ever heard from her. Over the next few weeks, things started to change. The HOA, under new leadership, became almost unrecognizable. They stopped issuing ridiculous violations, homeowners started pushing back against unfair rules, and for the first time, the neighborhood felt like a place where people actually had a say in what happened to their homes. The petition to audit HOA finances and past board decisions gained traction, and while no one said it outright, it was clear they were looking into everything Karen had done during her time in power. Karen herself didn't last long in the neighborhood. Rumors spread that she was trying to sell her house quietly, hoping to slip away before the consequences of her reign caught up with her. A few months later, her house sat empty, a for sale sign stuck in the lawn where she had once stood, barking orders at homeowners. One evening, I stood by my window, looking out at the view that no one could take from me. The trees were still there. My home was still mine. And the fear that had once hovered over this community had finally lifted. It wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been bullied by a corrupt HOA. But it made me wonder, how many people had been through the same battle and didn't win? How many homeowners had been forced to give in, forced to tear down parts of their property, forced to live in fear of people like Karen? Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA, or a Karen in your life? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.